there when the bomb went off. He was not there when the bomb went off, but he was there when he spread it.
So you're still unemployed. So he only did it because he didn't get a bonus?
That's what the government said, yes.
Okay, I'm going to preempt Keith Jones here because, he's a rather, I've had enough of him already, so. But, if you have more questions after this, feel free. We'll hang out for a bit and we'll hold off our beers and we will talk to you. Hey, thanks, Keith.
Please.
I promise I'll keep you guys entertained as well. I have 3 caveats before I start my portion of the presentation. The next few slides, they're 99% accurate. They're not 100% accurate. And I say that because I had to hide the identities of some of the people because this did not make it out to the public. So that's the 1% inaccuracy in there. It didn't have as happy an ending as Keith Jones' case did. I do not articulate my words as well as Keith does because he does spend a lot of time with lawyers and I don't, fortunately. So if you ask me, was that guy dumb? I would have said yes. And the third thing is, if during my presentation you have any hard technical questions, Keith is still on the stage, so point them at him. Don't ask me those.
Well, not technically anymore.
So with that being said, we move on to the next case. This was another insider case, and I'm giving away the conclusion here. Again, this is up for speculation, and I do have some slides out there to get some input from you guys because it did not have as happy an ending, like I said, as Keith Jones's trial did, or rather Roger Duronio's trial did. Sorry. What we found here was Keith and I worked this case together. An employee of a retail company on a corporate data network was unable to get to his email. So it started off as an IT help desk issue. I can't get to my email. There's a problem. Yada, yada, yada. The IT guy shows up there. It's a Friday evening. He doesn't want to deal with it. He finds out, well, he's unable to ping the mail server. So the first thing he did was ping the mail server. Unable to do that. Well, interestingly enough, when he ran an IP config on the system, he found that there was a virtual network adapter on the system.
Still here.
Okay, thanks. With an IP address of 10.8.0.5. And that kind of seemed strange because what's the virtual network adapter doing? This machine had just supposed to have one network interface connected to the corporate Ethernet. What he also found was that the actual Ethernet address was 10.1.0.2.05 and the mail server IP was a 10.8.0.2. So guess what was happening here? The SMTP requests were being pushed over the virtual network adapter, and they obviously weren't getting on to the actual Ethernet, weren't getting to the mail server. So the person was unable to access email. Well, this seemed like an issue. Where did the virtual network adapter come from, and so on and so forth. We were called into the investigation at this time. They found that there was potentially some signs of malicious activity on the system. Well, when we got there, obviously we looked at the virtual network adapter, all the other evidence that they had collected. What we found almost instantaneously was that OpenVPN was running as a service on this machine. When we interviewed the administrators, they said that there was no reason for it to be there. It wasn't a part of their standard build procedures to include OpenVPN on workstations. So obviously that was a red flag. Why is OpenVPN running on these systems? We also saw that the OpenVPN config file had the IP address of the gateway that it was connecting to the outside world. And it was a spurious connection to the outside world. And if I remember correctly, it was in a foreign country. So there was a random IP address that the virtual network adapter was actually set up to send traffic over. Well, what we also found on the system on this particular workstation was when we ran NetUse, we found that there was a bunch of NetBIOS shares that had been mapped. Interestingly enough, the workstation had mapped the $C share of a credit card processing server. So going from the corporate network through a firewall, NetBIOS, mapping the $C share on a credit card processing system. What we also found was that there were NetBIOS connections from a store network to this potentially compromised workstation. So it was a three-way street here. Store network coming into the corporate compromised workstation, going to the credit card processing server. Obviously, we started looking at firewall rule sets where probably the firewalls are not even turned off, NetBIOS going all over the map there. Fortunately, at the time of this activity, they had realized that their firewalls were rather permeable And they did have an effort underway where they did want to hone these firewall rule sets down. So they had extensive logging enabled on both the store to corporate network firewall as well as the corporate network to the credit card processing server, that network, the firewall. They were not only logging drops, but they were performing extensive logging, which was great for us. We could actually go through those logs and try and understand where these connections were coming from. Interestingly, when we reviewed these log files, we found that there was no footprint of port scanning activity whatsoever. So going back to what Keith spoke about in the slide before his case study, no port scanning. So the footprint was extremely small. Someone seemed like they knew what they were doing. Connections from the victim to one of the 3 credit card processing servers. If they had to get on the credit card processing server, we scanned it for vulnerabilities after the fact, found it up to date on patches, fortunately. The passwords were complex. So it had to be someone who had knowledge of the password, knew how to get on these systems. So the pieces of the jigsaw were kind of coming together. Now at this point, like Keith mentioned earlier, we were rather careful because you never know if the insider is in on the investigation. The system administrator or the network administrator we are asking for the firewall logs might be the guy who's done this. So we have to be rather careful, keep the investigation under wraps, and operate at all kinds of crazy hours. So what do we know so far? That the attack potentially originated from the store network, created NetBIOS connections to an employee workstation that was compromised, went from there to the credit card processing network, and there was an open VPN service running on the compromised workstation, making connections to the outside world. So that's all fair and good. There was all these crazy connections all over the network. But did this attacker, did this phantom insider, did he or she do anything on the credit card processing server? Was there any signs of malicious activity? And yes, we did find traces of a sniffer running on the credit card processing server, sniffing for very specific ports. It was sniffing for 6 ports, which were very specific to the application that processed the credit cards. Again, sign of insider activity here. What we also found was that there were some scripts on there which were written up to collect flat files, to collect credit card data in flat files, ship them to the employee workstation via NetBIOS, and then on that workstation send them out on the open VPN connection to that outside point somewhere out there. Well, at this, you might have someone might raise a question at this point. This is a retail company. They are processing credit card data. The firewalls seem rather permeable. The credit card information seems to be in flat files. Does that ring a bell for anyone from a compliance standpoint? Right? What about PCI? What happened to PCI here? So when I saw this, one of my first questions was, have you been PCI certified? And the startling answer was yes. They were a PCI certified company. And not to blame this company, because they actually went to an outside merchant or a consulting company who did PCI audits, and they were certified. So that was very interesting to me. Easy to get PCI certifications. Now, the big question was, who is this attacker who knows which ports to sniff on, how to connect to these systems without port scanning, know exactly which ports to use, what credentials to use, and make his or her way through the different firewalls? Well, it seemed like it was someone who had, like I said, who had an insider knowledge. The attacker's source IP address was attained. So what we did find on the system, in the firewall logs, that the activity had originated over the wireless network at a store. The reason we were able to do that, because every store had a set of different IP addresses allocated just to the wireless segment. And this IP address that was logged in the firewalls going from the store network to the compromised workstation showed us that at the time of this activity, that was the IP address connecting inbound. What we also know is that if it was over the wireless connection, then the person either had to be in the store or in close proximity of it. And there had to be some vulnerabilities or some way for the person to get on the wireless network, which we all know is very difficult to do. So the person was getting on a wireless network, making his way all the way through the network. So imagine from a store wireless network to the core credit card processing systems without a footprint of malicious activity. Also, interestingly enough, at this organization, the way they were structured, because there was antiquated systems in place, the wireless network seemed to be completely outdated, did not support any of the supposed security measures that you find these days on wireless networks, but also that they had a backup domain controller at every store location, just to be able to, in case they lost connectivity with the corporate network. So BDC sitting at every store, which can be reached via the wireless network. Not a good idea. So at this point, Keith and I decided that it was in our best interest, continuing this investigation, to actually take a trip down to this store and determine how an attacker might make his way in this form. When we decided to do that, we were briefed and told that obviously we were not supposed to go there as computer forensics investigators. That kind of, that's not the most sexy profession anyways, but, people don't like to hear that they got forensics investigators coming here. So we had to do this at crazy hours, and Keith and I were dressed in jeans and dirty-looking shoes and horrible T-shirts and stuff. And whenever anyone approached us and asked us who we were, we're the computer maintenance guys. Something wrong with the hard drive. We'll be out of here soon enough. Now, Keith's, again, given the fact that we were looking at the wireless network of the store, the vulnerabilities potentially in the BDC that might have been exploited, and we were going to also get a forensic image of the BDC, which Keith was doing while I was looking at the wireless network. Keith's not the most competent guy, by the way. Just kidding. No, actually, when we showed up there, we were met with some strange hardware requirements, and Case and a bunch of the other tools were complaining because lack of drivers for the RAID controllers. So we had all kinds of crazy hardware issues to deal with. So it took us unexpectedly long to be able to pull an image off this box. And because of which the store employees kept coming by and saying, "Come on, computer maintenance guys, get going, get out of here. We got the store opening." So it was a very interesting morning. But anyways, back to the investigation. I was actually looking at the wireless network, and the first thing I did was I just plugged in Kismet with a GPS map and drove around the place to say, well, how close really does an attacker have to be to the store to be able to get on the wireless network? Now, when I do that kind of stuff, I normally do the first run without any sort of antennae. I say, let's assume the guy just plugs in a 300 milliwatt card, which is one of the best cards you get out there, and see how far you can get. Well, just with that, the person was able to get into the parking lot, but well beyond. There was hotels all around, and a person could have been sitting in a hotel room, a couple of condos around this place, and been breaking into this network. So that made the situation even more difficult for us. It's not possible for us to knock every door down and say, "Are you on a wireless network right now?" So what we decided to do at this point, the company that we were working for did want to try and find who this person was. There was some speculation because since they had a lot of IT infrastructure at every store, they also had an IT administrator dedicated to 5 or 6 stores, so a collection of 5 or 6 stores. Interestingly enough, the IT administrator for the 5 or 6 stores under which this one fell had been fired 8 weeks ago. Lived in that neighborhood. Knew his way around. So we said, well, we're going to try and get this person. It was antiquated wireless infrastructure, so we found no logging on it. There was no support for investigative activity. So what we did is we set up the DHCP server to send us an alert the moment it saw an IP address being handed out on the wireless segment. So we would know whenever anyone got on the wireless network, we would know it. And we recommended that the store employees don't get on the wireless network for their inventory management, but plug in their systems. So that was the first thing we did. The next thing we did was we turned down the transmit power on the access point. I mean, so that it doesn't go well beyond across the highway into hotels. Tried to limit it just about close enough in the parking lot of the store. Why did we do that? Exactly. You guys are all smart. So we wanted to try and get this person